The message is still loud and clear in our ongoing coverage of the fight for racial equality.
You start with your community. You start with your family. You start with your corporation. You start with your neighborhood.
A special edition of WCPO 9, From Protests to Solutions, the movement for change.
Only one officer has been indicted in the Breonna Taylor case, sparking more protests from people saying those charges are not enough. The calls for justice and racial equality are loud and clear, and tonight we're focusing on where the movement for change goes from here, a change that must happen on many levels. From politics to the classroom to conversations with our children, how do we make the tri-state a welcoming place for everyone, every business, no matter their race? This summer's protests pushed Ohio lawmakers to write a record number of police reform bills. But the question begs, when will we see something more from politicians? Reporter Larry Seward asked several elected officials. And Larry, some Ohio officials expect a new law soon.
Before year's end, they do. More than a dozen bills first need vetting, but Ohio Governor Mike DeWine sees bipartisan motivation.
The time has come, what we have seen on TV, some of the very tragic cases. There's no American can look at that, look at the chokehold and person dying on the screen. No one can look at that and be happy with that.
What is his name? George Floyd, I can't breathe.
Following George Floyd's killing in Minnesota, weeks of protests and pressure to change law enforcement, 15 proposed laws landed in Ohio's legislature. Bills targeting biased policing, arrest and ticket quotas, de-escalation training, and use of force.
We in Ohio don't have a definition of what excessive force is on the books.
Officers who use guns, tasers, or bare hands detaining people only reported to Ohio's Office of Criminal Justice if they want to. Filing any use of force report is voluntary. Bond Hill's Cedric Denson co-wrote House Bill 709 to make it mandatory. Meanwhile, fellow Democrat Cecil Thomas is pushing a bill that attacks status profiling or stopping poor people more than the rich.
One of the areas of concern has to be our fraternal order police. They have to be at the table, to stay at the table when it talks about other methods of reform. What can we do better?
In this report on police reform and racial justice, a team of mayors, including Cincinnati's John Cranley, claims arbitration makes it hard to discipline and remove bad officers. It also claims collective bargaining agreements block investigations when complaints begin with anonymous tips or video from a bystander. Mayors also claim CBA provisions delay investigations with long recovery and cooling off periods for accused officers while requiring resolution in 90 days. The report also says CBAs require disciplinary records be destroyed, even if investigations led to suspension or worse.
You have officers who have been attempted to be fired or disciplined, reinstated against the will of the police chief.
That's happened here.
Oh, it's happened here multiple times, and it's happened in every city in America.
Do you agree with that assessment?
Not at all. Not at all. I see our police chief is able to discipline folks all the time. I haven't seen officers that have horrible behavior returned again and again or anything of that nature. On the other hand, what I've seen is a couple times some very politically motivated discipline. We're in the business of due process. We don't arrest bad guys and they go to jail without due process. Everybody has a right to a hearing, everybody has a right to a trial, and police officers have a right to due process. In some cases, I think the people who want to tear down policing are getting what they want. They're getting people to be less interested in law enforcement.
I'll challenge him on that. I'll challenge him definitely on that. Good officers want to do the right thing. Oftentimes, an officer who feels that I can't do it the way I used to be able to do it, those officers are probably the ones who want to leave.
Ultimately, in my opinion, practical, reasonable reform is the best thing long-term to improve morale of the police and reduce gun violence.
House Bill 703, which is professional police practices.
Harrison Cindy Abrams, a former Cincinnati police officer, co-wrote House Bill 703.
But we have met with chiefs, we've met with sheriffs, we've met with the FOP, we've met with faith-based leaders. We have met with anyone who wants to meet with us.
Supported by Governor DeWine, it calls for a statewide discipline database to prevent officers forced off a job from joining smaller departments.
You know, you might wonder, why don't they ask? I mean, sometimes they don't have the resources to actually, fully investigate someone's background.
In the movement for change, her proposal would create new oversight, no different than medical boards. But this one controls who is licensed to enforce Ohio law. So far, the idea only has Republican signatures, but with Democrats pushing similar moves, Governor DeWine expects reform soon.
I'm sure that, we're going to end up with a good, solid bill that I can sign and that will make a difference.
Here in Cincinnati, Mayor John Cranley wants written input from Police Chief Elliot Isaac within the next 4 weeks. After that, he expects quick action from City Council.
Larry Seward, thank you. Well, in today's racial climate, many workplaces are trying to improve their culture with diversity training. But earlier this month, the president instructed federal agencies to stop those sensitivity exercises, calling them divisive. WCPO 9 News reporter Kristen Swilley talked to local experts in the field who say those trainings are necessary.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings run the gamut, depending on who's leading them and what specific issues the company is trying to address. But the women I spoke to say these conversations are needed now more than ever.
So when they reached out to me, it was an opportunity I couldn't say no to.
For decades, Janetta Darno has answered the call. From her military background to her current role as UC Health's first Chief Diversity Officer.
They've been making quite a bit of progress already around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and realized to make a strategic, sustainable change effort around this, that they needed someone to lead the work.
Darno, who's led diversity and inclusion efforts for more than 25 years, says addressing inequities in healthcare during a pandemic is critical to save lives and build trust.
There's that shared experience that's missed. If you're not inclusive and understand someone's cultural background and experiences or even language barrier.
She says bridging that gap helps both the patient and physician. Adding healthcare systems that fail to meet this moment head on may be hurting down the road.
And healthcare providers and organizations that do that and understand that our demographics are shifting and that experiences are different will be the ones who will be able to provide the best outcomes for our patients.
For Janet Reed, the journey to a more inclusive workplace has taken her around the globe. She's worked in more than 50 countries and led corporate diversity training, including for our parent company, EW Scripps. She's worked on every continent except Antarctica. In the past few months, she's watched the desire for this sort of shift in company culture grow.
I would say that many start with what's typically called diversity training. But you can have a very diverse team sitting around the table, all ages, all kinds of differences in people and similarities, but it doesn't mean it's inclusive.
Another obstacle is participants feeling left out or targeted. Reed overcomes that by reminding her audience that all backgrounds, whether religious, ethnic, socioeconomic, or otherwise, are diverse.
I would say lean sometimes into the discomfort of doing some things that you have not done in the past, because the end benefit is very great and rich.
And both agree it's about everyone working together in order to grow.
When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is not a competitive sport. That we share best practices across not just healthcare systems, but industries, so that we lift up together across Cincinnati.
Both of these women, again, with decades of experience, say companies that forego this sort of training really run the risk of losing out on diverse clientele and employees and not taking full advantage of a diverse workspace. Kristen Swilley, WCPO 9 News.
The movement for change goes beyond politics and policing. Here in the tri-state, many business owners are trying to strengthen the region by helping minority-owned businesses grow. And coming up next, we'll tell you about a new strategy that is already paying off. Welcome back. The movement for change in the business community started years ago here in Cincinnati. The Minority Business Accelerator in the Cincinnati USA Regional Chamber was launched 17 years ago to help grow minority-owned companies in an effort to strengthen communities. WCPO 9 News reporter Lucy May explains how the accelerator has expanded its work to attract new minority-owned companies to the region and how that strategy is already paying off.
Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results, so this is something that's new.
Barb Smith is president of Journey Steel, a steel fabrication company in Roselawn. What's new is her company's partnership with Vasquez Commercial Contracting, a Kansas City business that wants to help Journey Steel get contracts with the federal government.
We want to be able to expand our revenues 10 times what they are now. And realistically, that is something that just talking with Vasquez and the opportunities that are out there and where they've seen their numbers go, that is a realistic goal.
We have had incredible growth.
Vasquez Commercial Contracting CEO Joe Vasquez is expanding his business into Greater Cincinnati with help from the Minority Business Accelerator.
Over the last 5 years to where we're close to 100 employees and almost $50 million in revenue.
He's already collaborating with 9 local small businesses, including Journey Steel and Leona Enterprises, an information technology firm in Over the Rhine.
After about 6 months of due diligence, we have already got to the point where we have a couple employees already on staff. We just won our first project with Leona, and the office is where we are at now.
It's more of a strategy around expansion.
Darren Reedus leads the Minority Business Accelerator for the Cincinnati USA Regional Chamber. He says helping companies like Vasquez grow here will mean more jobs for the tri-state.
Our minority entrepreneurs create job opportunities for all citizens. Absolutely, there is a practice, etc., to make sure that they're hiring within the minority community, absolutely. But it's not at the expense of others. And so you're talking about more job-creating engines for the community as a whole.
A 2019 study by LendingTree.com listed Cincinnati as the 10th best city in the nation where minority entrepreneurs are succeeding, right behind Atlanta.
We still have a lot of work to do, of course, here in the Cincinnati region, but we also have a terrific foundation to build upon.
It really comes down to when you have minority businesses that are successful, then they take that success and they bring it down to other minority businesses where that just really snowballs within the whole area.
Smith says she's confident Journey Steel's work with Vasquez will spark the growth her company needs to make the difference she dreams of making.
And I think that it will begin to be the change that we've always talked about. This is one of the dreams that we've had for Journey, to be able to penetrate markets that we haven't been able to get into, to have a voice where we haven't had a voice before, to be able to help others and share the answers and understand and really, let them know we've been there and now we've overcome and we want to help you overcome.
Lucy May, WCPO 9 News.
They say actions speak louder than words, but can we move forward without addressing systemic racism? That story is next. Welcome back. So what is systemic racism? It is hard to define by some, lived daily by others. WCPO 9 News reporter Lisa Smith assembled together a panel of community leaders to discuss how racism is rooted in our community and what it will take to bring about healing.
A candid conversation.
This has been ongoing, and people who have been in the struggle were exhausted. We're tired.
About systemic racism and what it means.
I think America woke up when we watched, the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd.
There are people who are saying, well, I'm not racist. That spirit is still alive.
I assembled a panel of community leaders to share their views about how racism is embedded in our country and community and how to treat it and heal from it.
Trauma not treated is transferred.
The panel included Ellen Katz, CEO of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, Dr. Kyra Shahid, Director of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at Xavier University, Darryl Peal, Chief Diversity Officer at Northern Kentucky University, Christopher Miller, Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and Patricia Pope, CEO and Chief Creative Officer at Pope Consulting.
How important is it to, one, admit that there is systemic racism? And then secondly, how do you recognize it? How is it defined?
All too often, we forget that many institutions and organizations were never designed to have people of color there. They never anticipated people of color participating in the programs, attending the universities, and then so many of the practices and policies that we have in place really don't allow us to have full citizenship in the organization, full citizenship on the campus, or full participation in the institution. And so that's when you recognize that when those barriers become part of the fabric of the institution, you have systemic racism.
I think it is important to acknowledge it. One of the things I always say is the inherent challenge in diversity is that it's very difficult to understand someone else's reality that's not your own because it's not yours. That 8 minutes and 46 seconds caused a real shift to occur in this country in a way that I haven't seen in the 44 years I've been doing this work.
It's an understanding that this has been so woven into the fabric and culture of our country, race has been, but we choose not to have the conversation because it's uncomfortable. But it has always been there.
So how do we start that conversation? And Dr. Shahid, you've talked about the need for healing because we have these repeated episodes where basically the scab keeps getting ripped off of racism here in our country.
I think healing has to begin for everybody exactly where you are. We have so many students who are coming forward and they want to know, rightfully so, right? Like, what can I do to get involved? How can I make a difference? I'm not Black. I don't have a Black experience. And I'm going, what does that have to do with racial trauma? Because Black folks don't own racism. And guess what? We can't fix it. So you start with your community. You start with your family. You start with your corporation. You start with your neighborhood.
We're trying to begin the dialogue around racial equity and how to get there with truth. And that comes from history, just learning our history in a way that is not whitewashed, that just speaks the truth of what has happened in our nation. And we have found that people who have engaged in these conversations just can see the dynamics of structural racism in very different ways.
Lisa Smith, WCPO 9 News.
Well, that was just a small part of that conversation. To watch all of it, head on over now to WCPO.com. We'll be right back. Finally tonight, a question. How can we make progress when there are still symbols of racism and racial equality all around us in the form of buildings and monuments tied to slavery? We follow our Whitney Miller to some of them and ask what's being done about them.
Not only does Smale Park reconnect downtown Cincinnati to the riverfront, it also connects you to the city's past.
It also was the gateway to freedom for hundreds of people who crossed over the Ohio River heading north.
Looking closely, you'll see this symbol, the Black Brigade of Cincinnati Monument. It honors the Black men who helped fight to keep the city out of the hands of Confederate troops in 1862.
The Black community here tried to organize to put together a militia, but they were advised by the mayor to cease because this was not a war of their concern.
Instead, 300 Black men were forced at gunpoint to protect the city until a Union general advised the men should be allowed to choose if they wanted to help. More than 700 Black men returned the next day.
It's a beautiful, beautiful Cincinnati story, but it also talks about those parallels when it deals with race relations and those dynamics. Why did the mayor at that time decide to do force when they were willing to volunteer?
Here on the UC campus, a former slave owner's name is etched onto the College of Arts and Sciences. Charles McMicken, the university's co-founder, wanted UC to exclusively educate white students. In December, his name was removed from the college, but remains on buildings. There is a digital display putting into context McMicken's tie to the university.
For some of us, we think that removing the tradition or removing the marker or the symbol will remove our history. I don't think that's true. I think it gets in the way of our healing.
Dr. Kyra Shahid directs the Center of Diversity and Inclusion for Xavier University. She also leads the Stained Glass Initiative project, which is working to reconcile Xavier's historical connection to slavery,
after learning that Bishop Edward Fenwick, Cincinnati's first bishop and founder of the university, owned slaves.
Being able to see racism that's hidden in plain sight, and it's not really hidden, right? Like, it is clearly a statement of white supremacy.
Since launching the initiative, Shahid's group has received more than 200 nominations of new names for the Fenwick Place Residence Hall. She feels leaving the name in place is a sign of racial wounding.
I think the renaming pieces, as symbolic as they may be, are opportunities for us to innovate and to create, right? And to reimagine what community looks like.
An opportunity to focus on healing.
All of this is about a lot more than a name change.
Whitney Miller, WCPO 9 News.
Well, we want to thank you for spending time with us for our special tonight, From Protest to Solutions, the Movement for Change. There is still a lot of work to do, but we can do it together. For more information on how you can continue the conversation, head over to WCPO.com. I'm Tamika Artis, and on behalf of myself and all of us here at WCPO 9,